You're about to enter into a new world of knowledge, curiosities, and high strangeness. This is a podcast of Straight Up Strange Productions.
You're listening to Mysteries and Monsters. I'm your host, Paul Bestall. Welcome to the first part of the 250th episode of Mysteries and Monsters. Firstly, a big thank you to the marvellous Weary Pines for my new intro, and as you'll hear later, outro music. You can find links to all their music and releases in the show notes as usual. So, as a thank you to you, my lovely listeners, I've two of my most popular guests returning for two special 250th episodes. On this first part, we welcome Ruth Roper-Wylde, who joins me to discuss several brand new first-hand accounts from her upcoming These Haunted Times Volume 3. We feature cases from Finland, South Africa, and the length and breadth of England, including some strange goings-on late at night in deep, darkest London. Don't forget you can click on the links for Ruth's work in the show notes as usual. A massive thank you as always to Ruth for joining me and sharing some of these exclusive news stories with us all. Before we get there, don't forget you can support Mysteries and Monsters by signing up at patreon.com/Mysteries and Monsters. $4 a month gets you ad-free episodes, guaranteed early releases, bonus content, and more. You can also click the link in the show notes as usual. I'd just like to say a massive thank you to each and every single one of my patrons who continue to support the show with their kind donations. Thank you one and all. Mysteries and Monsters is across all social media platforms. Please subscribe to the Mysteries and Monsters channel on YouTube. And don't forget, you can visit mysteriesandmonsters.com for merchandise and news, as well as episodes. A big thank you to Dean Bestall for his marvellous artwork on each and every episode. The show is produced by the lovely Brennan Storr of the Ghost Story Guys, and Mysteries and Monsters is delighted to be a part of the Straight Up Strange network. So, the first part of episode 250 begins in the company of the wonderful Ruth Roper-Wylde. Ghosts and the stories of people that encounter them have long been popular all over the world. Despite everything that has changed in the world around us, if anything, the appetite for the paranormal has continued unabated. As such, one of the authors and investigators whose reputation continues to grow is one of my most popular guests, the marvellous Ruth Roper-Wylde. With a tantalising 2 more volumes of the fantastic collections on the way this year to spoilers, I'm delighted to welcome Ruth to help me mark one of my special 250th episodes. Ruth, welcome.
Thank you so much, and so nice to be here.
Oh, it's lovely. It's getting more and more regular. I don't just use you for October now, Ruth, and that's always a good thing.
Yeah, ghosts aren't just for Halloween, you know.
We should do that. We should do a Ghost Trusts sticker, Ruth. A ghost is for life, not just for Halloween.
That's a good idea. Been millionaires before you know it.
I'm sure by the time this episode, within an hour of this episode landing, someone will have stolen that and sell them on Etsy.
Yeah, probably.
So, Ruth, you have been extremely prolific since you dipped your toe into the world of the paranormal. I think we can kind of say this is your 7th year as a published author across all the books that you've released in that time.
Yeah.
Are you surprised, amazed, or quite ambivalent to the fact that here we are in 2023 and you have the exciting news that you are going to spoil us all this year with 2 new books, which just shows that these stories just keep on coming, don't they?
Well, it honestly never ceases to amaze me, and that's the truth. When I first decided I was going to write a book, I'd been keeping the database at that point of paranormal things that interested me for something like 30 years. So in my head, I was going to empty that database into maybe 1, maybe 2 books, and then that would be it. You know, I would have achieved what I'd been spending 30 years looking at, researching, making the database about. What happened instead, as you well know, is I wrote the first book was just a little tiny book to test the waters of how you write a book and how you get it published, which was The Ghost of Marston Vale. And then I separated the rest of my data into essentially anniversary ghosts for the Almanac of British Ghosts and ghosts that haunt our roads and byways for the Road Map of British Ghosts.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought there might be one more book to cover some of the ones that haunt buildings and so on.
Yeah.
And I genuinely thought that would be it. I would have emptied my databases, and by the time I, accumulated more, I'd have shuffled off this mortal coil myself and be a ghostwriter in the best sense of the word. But instead what happened was every time I go out on social media asking about X location or Y location that was in my database, I would get people answering saying, well, either yes or no, I have or haven't had an experience there, but have you looked at such and such, or my place of work is haunted, or my cousin's house is haunted, and some people would give me 3 or 4 new locations. So I started dutifully adding them to the databases, and they just grew and grew. So the first 2 books were published, and I genuinely thought that the Road Map of British Ghosts was going to be the definitive work on those ghosts that haunt our roads and byways in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote These Haunted Times Volume 1 because I realised there might just be a Volume 2 by that stage, which there was. By that time, people kept giving me more and more stories about ghosts on roads, so I had to write another Road Map of British Ghosts, which is even bigger than the first one.
Yeah.
Then I wished I'd called the first one Volume 1 because I've had to call the second one Volume 2. So I've learned my lesson now. And of course, in writing that, I get dozens and dozens more stories. And thought, well, before I think of a new genre or a new idea, I'd better do These Haunted Times 3, which was this year's endeavour, supposedly. But I was probably only a third of a way through writing it or researching it when I realised that I'd mucked up somehow, and it was already more than double the size it should be to be the right size for printing. At which point I thought, oh, that's coming out a bit bigger than I intended. And I can't put it out as this big a book because it'll just make it so expensive to print, it would price itself out of the market. Well, no, not to worry. I'll write it and then I'll just split it in half and make 2 books at once. It'll be easy. Of course, things are never quite that simple, are they? and I realised that you can't just write it and split it in half because you need to make sure that you're being fair to each book, because each book has got to stand alone in case that's the only one somebody picks up to read. So you've got to make sure that you've got a good smattering from all around the country, all different types of hauntings, really, really interesting ones where I got a lot of correlation, or ones where I had the original story but didn't find much correlation to go with it. And you've got to even that out across both books. So I've ended up, you would laugh if you saw it, honestly you would, I have yet another database now where it's all colour-coded to show which book it's going in, Volume 3 or Volume 4, and is it a first-hand account or a second-hand account that I've got. So all these different colours denoting different things, and I'm having to work through county by county as I write it, splitting it in half as I go, because otherwise it just gets too unwieldy and you can't keep your head around where you're up to with it. But they will both be out by the end of the year, so that's the good news. One might go slightly ahead of the other. But yes, I'm hoping with a bit of luck to have one out in time for Halloween and then the second one out in time for Christmas just a month or 2 later. So that's the new ambition. And yeah, one of these days I'll learn to slow down a bit, won't I?
Well,
Not.
Well, to be honest, Ruth, I'm just glad you're keeping us entertained. So it's I suppose it's one of those things, isn't it? It's a double-edged sword that it's wonderful once this starts, but it just shows you, I think, the surprising number of these stories that either haven't been covered, people haven't really dove into, that I think we forget just how many people have had experiences, or a relative has, or they work somewhere with people that had also had things, or they had a ghost where they worked even. They have a ghost at home. They have ghosts in a relative's house. We've got ghosts hanging about the roads. We've got ghosts on ships. I think it's one of those subjects now that even I'm sometimes surprised, especially in this day and age, how many of these stories have not seen the light of day in print, really, Ruth. And it just shows you how many people have had these experiences that have either only told their friends and family, and it's part of the modern sort of open-mindedness when we come to the paranormal, that it seems people are a lot more comfortable opening up to people such as yourself, Ruth, because they know you're going to treat them with the respect they deserve.
And I think that also has a lot to give thanks for your genre, for doing podcasts. Because I think doing something like this, where you and I have a conversation and people are able to hear the author speaking and, hear us having a genuine conversation about our views on the subject and so on, encourages people to think, actually, they sound like normal people that I could talk to. It's not all woo-woo and strange. I could actually speak to this individual. Because I get so many people that will write to me, after I've done a show, especially with yours, who will say, oh, I heard you on Mysteries and Monsters, and I thought I'd write to you with my story that I've never told anybody before. Or they might say, it's only a really tiny little thing, but you never know, it might help your research. When in actual fact what they've experienced is quite profound when you think in terms of this is not yet a field that has been unequivocally proven to be one thing or another. So anything anybody experiences, the fact that they experience it and they are a first-hand witness to it, makes it profound in its own way, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the fact that these people are willing to come forward and share their story, knowing that I will publish it, knowing that I'm likely to talk about it in public like this, because of course I do podcasts and I do public speaking as well, and and I'll tell stories in groups of people, in person. So these people are really letting their stories go out into the world. That I have some people who write to me. One gentleman wrote to me that springs to mind, who was in his 80s, and said, I have never told anybody this story before, but I heard you on one of the podcasts and I thought, right, I'm going to write in. Because I'm that old now, I don't care what people think of me. and I think the very fact that we normalise the conversation by, people like yourselves putting it out there in podcasts, people like me putting it out there in books that have people's modern relatable stories in them, not just dusty old monks and knights clanking around castles and things, but people's daily experiences of the paranormal, is what helps everybody come forward. And then you realise just how many people experience something in the time of their lives, the lifespan, and also just how many people experience it time and time again. And it's really quite astonishing. If I do a room, if I do a personal talk and there's, say, 60, 70 people in the room, I will bet that at least half of them will say they've had some sort of experience. And that's just the ones that are brave enough to say it out loud in a speaking personally sort of space. Mm. And so you'd look at that and think there's quite a few that daren't put their hand up because they're not the kind of people who like to speak in public, which is fair enough. But to me, that means that probably 3/4 of that room have either directly experienced or know a member of their family who have directly experienced something they can't explain, that falls under the general sort of umbrella title, if you like, of paranormal. Mm. And then when you add in, cryptid or UFO type phenomena, you pretty much get the whole population as seen one or the other of the three main genres. And you just end up thinking, well, it's no longer a question, does it happen? We're now just down to the question of why does it happen? Just looking at my databases will show you how much there is out there, yet to be explored, yet to be talked about, yet to be put in print. And the good thing about once it goes into print or goes onto a podcast, people will be able to see if they happen to live in that area and think, oh, I live on that street. That's interesting that 10 years ago on that street such and such happened, because I've been having X, Y and Z happen in my house or at the bottom of my garden, or whatever it might be. And that itself then encourages people to talk about it more. And I think anything to normalise the conversations has got to be worth doing.
Of course it has. And I suppose it's one of those things that I never expected, Ruth, when I first started doing this. I probably get a good dozen emails a week now from people all around the world, which still leaves me flabbergasted on occasion. and people will share all kinds of experiences with me, from strange things in the sky, cryptid encounters, hauntings, weird things in general. And when anybody ever takes the time to send me a line or a message on Facebook or something, the first thing I will always say is thank you very much for just dropping me a line, because as you say, and you refer to that old gentleman earlier, how many people have bottled these things up for so long because their family unit might be very disapproving. They may be of a certain religious slant where these subjects are quite taboo. They may work in a position that having certain interests or experiences are frowned upon. So it just shows you that once the dam bursts for some people, that's it. They just release all this pent up frustration, I imagine, that they've finally got a conduit who will listen to them without judging them or thinking any less of them whatsoever, and just let them tell their tale.
And I think as well, there's also a profound sense of relief sometimes when they realise that it's not the first time I've heard of that particular phenomena that they might be describing. Because particularly say with poltergeist activity, so often there are elements that seem to always be the same. And when somebody has been struggling with this, they haven't really known who to talk to, or if they have tried to talk about it, like you say, they've got kind of laughed at work by their work colleagues or whatever. And they finally find somebody like me or you to talk to about it or to email about it. And for us to be able to respond and say, well, actually, yes, I've come across that before, or I've come across similar things before. People have said X, Y, and Z. And like you, I always thank people for getting in touch with me. Might take me a little while, because particularly when I've got what I call my ghost posts out asking for information, it can go a little mad because people will messenger me. They'll find both my personal Facebook account and my author's Facebook account. They'll message on both of those or email me. So I've got it kind of coming in from 3 different channels, and it can be dozens at once, and of course they're posting on the Facebook post itself or the other social media posts like Twitter or whatever that I'm using. So I can get behind at times, and it takes me a little while to get round to speaking to everybody, or dropping them a line back or whatever. But I will always get back to them, even if it takes me a little while. And whether that's just in the form of a message back or an email back. Some people I speak to over the phone for their, if that's the way they prefer to give their stories. And some people I meet in person if it's, somewhere local enough, which happens every day. In fact, it happened last month. I was able to go out and meet somebody at their place of work, which was haunted. And that was absolutely fascinating, because you're absolutely, you're able to sit down with the person and spend sort of a quality hour talking about their experiences, being shown where it happened, and, giving them a chance to talk about what theories they've sort of been mulling around in their head and so on, and for them to pick your brains about what you think about what happened to them and so on. So it absolutely, needs to be a two-way street when people take the time to contact. And the other thing I always assure them is I never, ever use people's real names in my books unless they specifically ask me to. So you may well read names in my books, but they're always pseudonyms, unless I specifically say that it's their real name, or the context makes it, I might say so-and-so from such and such a paranormal group, and make it clear that the person is using their real name. And if it's a private address they're talking about, I'll mention the street it's on or the general location, but not which actual property, because obviously if they're still living in the house, they don't want strangers knocking on their door saying, we heard Ruth Wylde talking about you having a ghost in you.
Yes.
Wouldn't be fun on a Saturday night when you're trying to get the kids to bed, would it? Or worse still, they've now left that house, moved house or whatever, and some other poor soul is now living in it, and somebody knocks on the door and says, according to Ruth, this is haunted, and frightens the poor people half out of their wits, So I am careful to keep private locations private and people's private names private when I talk about them or when I publish it. And obviously if I do give the location, it's been given with full permission.
Well, I think we both are aware that there will always be individuals out there, as soon as they hear an address or something, Ruth, they will turn up. They'll just go. I've spoken to a couple of people in America, and I know I'm aware of one particular haunted house where they had to erect a fence because people were just turning up, digging up the garden. So they got a memento.
Oh, my word.
It's fascinating.
It's a bag of belief, doesn't it?
Well, it's amazing to me sometimes that there are individuals out there around the world who believe that if somebody talks about something, then they can just turn up and help themselves to something. I mean, there are some strange aspects to any kind of collector of any memorabilia whatsoever, but I think paranormal memorabilia is taking a bit. So, you know, there'll be people turning up and stealing bits of your fence and things, or your door knocker, no doubt, Ruth, if certain locations were available. I know I spoke to a lady a few weeks ago called Lindsay Brisbane, who had a incredible encounter for a year living in a very haunted house in the States. And she's never given the address, primarily based on that kind of situation. She knows that people will do that. And she finds it quite amusing now that when people will always tag her on things on social media saying, look, I'm outside the house. And they never are. They're just at the house that looks haunted, which wasn't where she lived.
Or thinks that they might have found it or something.
Yeah. So
people can be strange creatures sometimes.
Yes.
But yes, I am always very careful. If somebody wants you, I never give out real names unless they ask me to, and I'm always careful not to identify the actual house. You know, if it is a private property. Very often the places I'm writing about are more public locations as well, so then obviously it's not as important, because very often I've found the location in the first place because I've found a story published somewhere. And I'm trying to find a correlation for it. So it's already out there, if you like. I'm not revealing anything new about a place, insofar as it was already known to be a haunted location if you dug hard enough. What I do with my work is I go out and try and find new witnesses who've seen something in that location, you know, to sort of bring the haunting up to date, if you like. I think that's what keeps me endlessly fascinated in this subject and keeps me endlessly turning the research I do, because it's the finding the correlations bit that just gets me so excited. You know, if I find a location and I add it to my database, and then I go out and I start trying to find other people that have seen it and see if I can find some first-hand accounts, see if I can persuade anybody to talk to me. When I manage to get those, the buzz is amazing that I've managed to find a witness for that location. And when I get 4, 5, 6, 7 witnesses for one location, it just feels like you're winning the jackpot sort of thing.
Yeah.
And that's what just keeps me, because people often say to me, you know, you're a very prolific writer. On the whole, I've put out almost one book a year since I started doing this, which I'm told is quite fast for people publishing books. But it's simply because I love spending my spare time delving into these stories. You know, it just endlessly fascinates me. And I'm lucky enough to be partially retired now, so I only have to do real work 2 days a week. And 5 days a week I get to indulge my passion. It's like, what would be better?
Absolutely. I always love conversations. Obviously, I work for a very large company in my real job, Ruth, and it's interesting sometimes when I speak to people. I remember speaking to a colleague who was from Sorky in Scotland, and he lived on the same street as the famous poltergeist case of the 1960s. So I said, "Oh, you live in Sorky? Brilliant, yeah. You're on the house where the poltergeist was." And he was amazed. He was like, "Oh my goodness, how do you know about that? Where you live?" I said, "Well, you know," and we started talking. And then he went, "Oh yeah," he said, all the houses on that street are still haunted. We've all got ghosts up here. It's crazy. I didn't know why everybody just focused on that one house."
Amazing.
Just very matter of fact, Ruth.
Yeah. Well, I won't say too much about it because it's going to be in the books, but there is a housing estate in a certain location in England, which I'll leave as a mystery until you buy the book, people, where the whole estate is haunted, basically. And I got so many people writing into me, you know, when I asked about a particular street. It's like, yeah, that street's known to be haunted, and the one next to it, and the one over from it, and the one, you know, all the ones around here. Everybody knows the houses are all haunted, and the streets themselves are haunted. And yet it's a fairly modern build housing estate, but it's built on, you know, much older land. But wait until you get the books. If I say what it was built on, it'll give it away where it is. So, but yes, when you find a location like that is just a proper paranormal hotspot, absolutely fascinating.
It is. I mean, I know. One of the first conversations we had, and neither of us could remember Pluckley, so I always like to mention it every time we talk afterwards, Ruth.
Yes, to save our lives that night.
Yeah, the most haunted village in Britain, and neither of us could remember it, despite the fact that we.
It begins with a P, doesn't it?
You know what I mean? It's like word association. It's one of those things. What was that? something happened. The reason I mention it is I was flicking through something, and I stumbled across a wonderful old ghost documentary from the 80s that was about Pluckley. And it was one of those sort of very matter-of-fact ones where it's done that, very posh narrator, Ruth, and he's interviewing lots of lovely old ladies talking about their resident ghosts. And it just makes me chuckle every time I hear Pluckley now. I just remember the day me and you couldn't pull that name out of the air forever.
Call ourselves paranormal researchers, eh?
But once again, this shows you that, and it surprises me that there are some of these places, as we were joking, people, when we were growing up, everybody would talk about Pluckley being the most haunted village in Britain all the time. Now, you hardly hear anything about it at all, Ruth.
No.
Do you think that it's one of those sort of classic hauntings that time has moved on, or that it was so done to death, because it was never a big place in the first situation, that people have just kind of moved on for it because they don't think there's only so much you could have done in that particular area anyway, and most people think perhaps it's all been done before?
Perhaps. And perhaps it's a case of, the haunting itself has kind of faded out. Because I think that can happen, that something can be very active for a time and then gradually fade out. But I'm just racking my brains because I have got in one of the books, and I can't for the life of me remember which one it is now, talking about not being able to remember, but I have got one more recent account of something happening in Pluckley.
Yes.
I can't for the life of me remember which book it's in. But it is just one small snippet account. It's not a big occurrence or happening. It's just a small snippet. And yes, you're right, you don't hear about it in the same way, which might be, like we said, maybe it is quieter than it used to be in paranormal sense. Mm. It might also be because there is now so much more available about the paranormal. Books like mine are more common than they used to be. We have the podcasts, we have television shows, we have radio, shows. I've been on a lot of radio shows about the paranormal, which gives people more opportunity to talk about other places. And that in itself might just have kind of swamped Pluckley into background noise, if you know what I mean. Because I think there just is more opportunity for information to get out than there was, you're describing that old sort of 1980s documentary, like you say, where somebody quite posh would go along and do some quite posh sounding interviews.
Yes.
Those days are gone, aren't they? And it's now much easier to get information at your fingertips. So people can get their stories out themselves now, just by posting it online, doing a YouTube video in a way that couldn't happen back then in the 80s. So I just wonder if there's the fact that there's more paranormal noise rather than less at Pluckley, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, it is strange sometimes that you can have hauntings or things essentially sitting under your nose, Ruth, and if nobody's pointed them out to you, then it's amazing how many just fly under the radar. Before I moved, I was not aware of the local parks ghost that I ended up writing an article for in Haunted magazine this year. And I'd never heard of that till I moved to the area at all. So it just shows you, I was aware of some of Sheffield's more notable hauntings, but this one had been seen sort of over a 10-year period by at least a dozen witnesses. I didn't know anything about it at all till I dug into it.
And it's quite interesting because I go out on local social media asking about ghosts. I quite often get given stories like that, where in that small village or, suburb of a town or whatever it might be, everybody knows that the corner of such and such a street, or the little park down the end of the road, or the houses along such and such a street, or the pub off the corner, everybody knows that that's haunted. And they'll all come back and say, of course, you've heard about the haunting on such and such. Oh, no, I haven't, so I'll put it on my database. And then when I go and look, there's absolutely zero that I can find online about it. I can't find it mentioned in any other books. I can't find it mentioned anywhere else. And it's just local knowledge. But it's taken as being so red that it hasn't occurred to people, I don't think, that it isn't known more widely than their own location. And it just... when you do as much research as I do and you realise that you could pretty much stick a pin in a map anywhere in the UK and you'd find a haunting within a mile of it. You know, you'd have to really be somewhere remote in the Highlands of Scotland to not find. Mind you, even when you do that, I'm sure I've told you the story in the past about my trip to Scotland last year.
Yes.
That was in the middle of nowhere. I mean, that was more than a mile from anywhere, and had an experience. So I think the UK particularly, we're just such a, like many parts of the world, we just have such a massively rich history going back thousands of years that there's so much scope for something to be embedded there, or for the land to have, you know, absorbed it, or whichever theory that you're currently thinking about. The UK is so rich for it, just like so many other countries that have long histories of human inhabitation.
Mm. It is surprising, like you say. I think, for me, your books especially are what I would consider vitally important in Britain's paranormal history, Ruth, because I would probably suggest that nearly every encounter or experience or witness that you have covered in your series of books so far has never had that story covered in a publication or been on television or wrote about it. So if you'd not done what you do, those stories would have been lost forever. None of us would have ever heard those stories other than that person's perhaps immediate family. It would be gone. So often people sort of overlook this aspect of this, and I think if we love this subject, collections such as yours and other authors out there who have started to sort of go back into their regions and look at their regional histories and the folklore and things, so much of these experiences and stories would have been lost to us all, which would have been a crying shame when, for people like me and you, we were brought up with the wonderful collections of people like Peter Underwood, where he would have these wonderful stories from all around Britain, covering these wonderful mostly in old haunted houses and castles and manor houses, it would seem. Peter seemed to like a good weekend away in a lovely country pile somewhere.
He really did, didn't he?
And who can fault him?
Exactly. Wise man.
So I think the work you do, Ruth, is vitally important in our paranormal history, because these are essential collections. These are stories that would have been lost forever, and we would have all been lesser for that.
Well, it's nice to hear you say that, because that is one of my main drivers in wanting to get it down in writing. You know, and I have talked about it before, and I'm sure the listeners will have heard me talk about it before, you know, that I got interested in this subject primarily because I grew up in a house with a very active poltergeist, which would have been in the 1980s, early 80s, late 70s, early 80s. And at that time, if you wanted to read anything about the paranormal, you had to go to a library and find a book, or if you were lucky, the library might have newspaper articles. But the world of information that today is at our fingertips was simply not there then. It just didn't exist in the way it does now. And to scrabble around as a young teenager experiencing a poltergeist and wanting to know what it was, there was just nothing out there that helped to any great degree. Then, of course, I did stumble across Peter Underwood's books, and he did at least delve into things and give more up-to-date hauntings and so on. And it was that desire to find things that were happening in my lifetime, not donkey's years ago, and that were happening to ordinary people like me, you know, that just lived in an ordinary house in an ordinary suburb with ordinary parents, you know, went to an ordinary school, and yet something very extraordinary was happening in the house. And I just always felt like that needs to be recorded, because if we don't get all that data down, then, like you say, it's going to be lost forever. And the chance for somebody to come along and make definitive final sense of what is the paranormal and what causes it is never going to happen, because the data isn't being recorded. And you know, that was my driving force as a teenager, to start keeping a card file record of what I found. And then, of course, I must just have had such an investigative bent in my mind always. You know, it must be sort of built into my DNA or something, because when I left school and started work, all my jobs, the first was in the library, which teaches you how to catalogue data.
Yeah.
And then since that, all my jobs have been investigation related, one way or another, which is all about sticking your nose into other people's business and trying to find out what happened, which is essentially what any investigator does.
Yeah.
And that's the ethos I've brought all along to my writing and my books, is trying to find that data. And like you say, so much of what I write is data that's never, ever been published anywhere else before. It's people's first-hand accounts or second-hand if it was their family member or whatever, but they've not spoken about it before. It's not appeared in a book before. It might be the haunting itself might have, but the accounts I'm finding that correlate with it and that extend the period of the haunting, perhaps from a one-off back in the 1980s to now, I'm able to show that it has consistently happened for 2 decades or whatever. That's what is so fascinating, and that's what I try to show when I'm getting the correlations and try and show that breadth of time that things are happening over. Because my idea is always that at some point in time, somebody much more intelligent than me will come along and be able to look at the data in things like my work, like your work, that is putting this down for posterity in, one media format or another, so that these stories aren't lost, because somebody then will be able to pore through them like a cold case detective almost, and be able to pull out those threads and pull out the common themes. Like I said a few minutes ago about, I notice when I'm told about poltergeists that there are certain things that always seem to be part of the activity. So a really good, if you like, cold case paranormal detective looking at my work, other people's work that are recording these for posterity, could pull that together and say, right, okay, this is the common denominator. If we can explain that, we might be able to explain the whole poltergeist phenomena, and so on with cryptids or white lady hauntings or spirits on the side of the road, or all these different things. Are they all the same thing? Are they a series of different things? Is there a series of different explanations? But we'll never know that if somebody doesn't gather the data and put it down. And that's where I see myself fitting into that bigger picture. My job is gathering the data and putting it down, not trying to interpret it or answer it, censor it in any way. So I will never, ever embellish what somebody has told me, nor will I ever ignore it because it seems too little. So I had somebody write to me recently about a particular location I was asking about, and all that had happened to them when they lived in that location was they were sitting one evening and a tube full of Smarties that had been sitting on the shelf for some time suddenly fell over. And that's all that happened. But that will go into the book because that was their experience, and that was in that location that's known to have had a haunting. So it may or may not be part of the evidence that's part of that. It might be a little key at some point that fits in with a wider picture of evidence. It's not up to me to try and censor that or judge that. So, and yeah, it does. Well, you can hear it just keeps me endlessly fascinated. It's nosy in me. That's obviously I was destined to be nosy. That's why I've got that kind of career and that kind of after career hobby.
Well, to be fair, somebody said something similar. One of my friends recently said something similar to me, that it was good to show these days that I'd put my love of the weird into something practical.
Which is a very kind way of saying you're a weirdo.
Yeah. Well, tell me something I don't know, Ruth.
Yeah. People say it to me all the time.
Well, as we were teasing earlier, you very kindly sent me some brand new cases that you've been sent. And one of the interesting aspects of this is that the first two are from abroad. One's from South Africa, which we occasionally hear ghost stories for. One of my favourite road ghost stories is from South Africa because some of the primary witnesses were police officers. And often these stories get dismissed as tall tales or whatever, but if you've got a group of police officers saying that they saw something weird going on more than once, then that's not as easy to dismiss as a tall tale. And they went on television to confirm this.
Wow, I think I've heard of that one.
I'll dig out a link to the to the interview, because it is on YouTube somewhere, so I'll dig it out for you and you can have a look at it and see what you want. It's about a hitchhiking ghost that just likes either getting in cars or getting on the back of motorbikes, so it's a good one. So South Africa, we occasionally get them, but Finland is a very, I suppose, as we were saying about what happens here with some of these stories, it does make you wonder what's going on in other parts of the world, especially in Europe and things, that we will occasionally hear stories from France or Germany or Italy, but they're always sort of specific cases. Like there is that famous story about the haunted villa in Italy, which probably came to prominence because one of the witnesses was obviously the actress Joan Collins on a particular dinner party one evening. And there's obviously haunted castles in Germany and the such like. But to see the second one that you sent me to come from Finland made me sort of sit up in my chair a bit more, because we just don't seem to get these wonderful kind of stories, especially from the Scandinavian region and especially from Finland.
And it's one of the things I've started sort of trying to ask for a bit more. I've started a database for ghosts other than the UK. World database. Watch out, world. She's coming to get you. And an ambition would be to fill that up enough to write a book. You know, simply because, like you say, we know the UK has such a rich history, and I can't see myself ever getting bored of writing about it. But I think it would be nice as well to write something about the rest of the world. So, you know, when people have taken the time to write to me and tell me their stories because they've heard me, you know, either on, you know, I've done some Canadian and American podcasts and what have you, and obviously quite a few here in the UK and obviously with yourself several times. And when people hear and they take the time to write in because they've heard the podcast or the radio interview from another country, and they know I primarily write about the UK, but they've still taken the time to write to me, to be able to air that, you know, like with the podcast now, I think is quite a tribute to them to have taken the time to write about it. But yes, ultimately, I'd love to have enough to put together a book for outside the UK, because I just think tradition and cultural beliefs and religious beliefs and social norms all come into it as to how the paranormal is viewed in different countries, don't they? And I think that'd be quite fascinating to see what the difference is as you sort of explore different types of culture with it. Yeah. But yes, definitely the Finland one, you know, to stick with that. This was a lady who wrote to me. She'd been to spend a break in Finland, and she was staying with a friend of hers for the whole summer. So she was staying with the friend. She was only about 14, 15 at the time, something like that. Her own family had gone to their cabin for the summer. She didn't want to spend the summer at the cabin because her friend's family lived in one of the towns, which seemed like a much more exciting place to a teenager to spend the summer. Mm-hmm. So she'd gone to spend the summer with her friend. And, of course, because it's summer and because it's Finland, the sun doesn't set in the summer. So there's plenty of opportunity for teenagers to be out having fun and enjoying it. And this particular day, her friend and she had decided to go to the local graveyard on their bicycles because it had a renowned, particularly beautiful church to go and look at. She also wanted to go because her father had family buried in that graveyard, and she knew that the war grave of her grandfather was there. So, you know, lots of reasons on a nice sunny day to take a bicycle ride out to this particular graveyard and go and have a look. And this was in a town in Finland called, she tries to remember, Tornio, which I may well have pronounced incorrectly, knowing me. So they left their bikes outside the gate, having got to the cemetery anyway, and started to walk through the cemetery. Now, unlike in the UK, in Finland, apparently, it's common practice to plant bushes, especially rose bushes or other flowering shrubs, on the graves so that, you know, they stay green and decorated sort of thing. Of course, in the UK, we tend to put cut flowers on graves rather than grow plants on the grave. So as they were walking past, all these rose bushes were in flower all across the grave plots. And as they walked past one particular grave, one of the rose flowers, somebody had knocked the head off, obviously passing by or whatever, or it had fallen off, but it was laying on the path next to the grave. So she picked it up and started carrying it with her. Now, her friend said, oh, you shouldn't do that. That belongs to the grave that it's come from. You shouldn't pick it up and carry it. But she ignored her, and they carried on walking. And a few moments later, they came across quite a big grave. She said it was surprisingly large, about 2 metres by 2 metres, had a little fence around it, like a little iron fence, and a big cross in the centre of it that was all rusty. And there were no plants growing on this at all. You know, it stood out because it didn't have any rose bushes or shrubs or anything growing on it. So feeling a bit sorry for it, as it were, that it was the only grave site without colour on it, she placed the rose that she was carrying, the rose head, on the railings of the grave. And again, her friend said, you shouldn't do that, and kind of walked off ahead of her in a bit of a huff, I think, saying you shouldn't do that, it's disrespectful. But she couldn't see why, so she kept on walking. She said it was a beautiful day, birds were singing, sun was shining, and just moments after she walked away from this grave, everything suddenly changed. And the whole day became sort of muted. She couldn't hear the birds anymore. It felt like the sun wasn't shining as brightly. And she heard coming up behind her heavy stomping footsteps on the sort of gravel path they were walking along. And before she had time to turn round, she suddenly felt as if somebody had grabbed her from behind and was holding her in such a tight grip that she couldn't move or step forward or anything. Wasn't hurting her, but was just stopping her from moving. She was so shocked that she didn't even call out or anything. But at that moment, her friend, who was a few paces ahead of her, turned round, obviously saw something behind her, and shouted, "I told you shouldn't have done that. He doesn't like it." And at that moment, whatever it was released her, and she was able to move again, and things seemed normal again. So she actually walked back to the grave where she'd put the rose on it and took it back off the grave and apologised, and everything seemed fine after that. But the really weird thing was it really bothered her what had happened, not surprisingly, because I think it would have us.
Yeah.
They went back a few days later to go and have a look at this grave to see who it was and see whether there's any correlation really on the name of the grave as to who'd walked up, how it felt the person who'd walked up behind her. But they couldn't find this grave at all. No matter how much they searched, they couldn't find it. And they even tried asking the priest at the church that the graveyard belonged to, and he said he'd never seen such a grave. He didn't know what they were talking about. So who knows how that suddenly seemed to be there. And the priest actually said to them, there's no way that there would be an untouched grave here anyway, because if they haven't been tended after 50 years, if no living family is tending to them, after 50 years, they're sort of redug and other graves put in on top of them, if you know what I mean, to use the space.
Yeah.
So they're sort of turned into like a smaller plot, if you like, to allow for the space if they're untouched. So there wouldn't be an untouched rusty one anyway, because it just wouldn't happen. So she has no idea what that was or quite what happened that day. She can only report that's what happened when she was sort of 15 years old. But isn't that upsetting?
It's amazing, because why did the grave site decide to make itself visible to these two young girls? Why? What was it? Because obviously her reaction, which to us, looking at what she did, it seems quite pleasant, that she felt a bit sorry for this grave, that there were no flowers on it. It seemed unloved, and therefore she thought, oh, well, I'll just leave this as a mark of respect. Was the ghost that turned up from the other grave where the flower had come from, and was annoyed that they'd shared their flowers with something else? But then again, why did this grave, or was it a test? Is that the thing?
You could rack your brains, couldn't you?
Yes.
For hours with this one. Because like you say, with a UK mindset, and this person who wrote to me had spent part of her life living in the UK and part of it in Finland. So, sort of alive to both cultures. Like you say, with a UK cultural mindset, we would see it as quite respectful to gently place a flower on someone's grave, even if we didn't know the person, and even if we just picked the flower up because it was, had broken off another grave. To quietly place it on another grave would be seen to be quite a respectful thing to do. And like you say, quite a nice thing to do. But her friend had reacted like in the cultural there locally, or whether it's a culture more widely known in Finland, I don't know. But she'd certainly reacted as you don't do that. You don't take things off a grave, even if it's fallen off. And you certainly don't put things from one grave to another grave. It's not the right thing to do. Or whether her friend was just as sensitive and had sensed the disquiet that this had caused, and that kind of manifested itself in something that held her and so on. You can actually think up quite a few different scenarios that fit this. And like I say, my job is to simply faithfully report and record what I'm told. So, yeah, make of that what you will.
Fascinating. And it's great when we get stories from countries that we've got very little exposure to, that it just shows you that what we think is a nice thing to do clearly doesn't go down well with Finnish spirits.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, the other aspect of this, the one you've got from South Africa is also very puzzling, because this seems to have two aspects to it, Ruth, because when I read it, I got halfway through and I thought, oh, it's like that, is it? And then when I got to the end, I thought, well, no, it clearly isn't. It's amazing that when you've got experience or exposure to the paranormal and you begin to read a report, you can suddenly halfway through decide, oh, well, that's where it probably is. And then by the end of it, you're like, no, that's wrong.
This was an interesting one, actually, and this took place in a place known as East London, funny enough.
Yes.
In South Africa. So it was in East London on a sort of complex called Parklands, which is on Jarvis Road. And this was a person who wrote to me to say that they used to live in a retirement, a block of retirement flats. So these are flats specifically for people that have retired. And, they sort of said to me, because of that, obviously, some people stay there until death and die in these flats, whereas others might go from the flats into care or whatever. And they've often wondered if, because it's one of those kind of liminal spaces where people are perhaps at a transitioning point of their lives, that's why what happened. They said they had occasional odd things happen in the ground floor flat that they lived in. So things, objects would sometimes disappear, they'd hear funny noises. So they always had a sense of there's something a bit odd about these flats, and particularly the flat they were in. But this particular day, they were woken up in the middle of the night by really, really loud whooping, hacking, coughing. Somebody was really struggling to get their breath, really coughing their guts up, as we'd say in England. They thought the sound came from the flat next door to them because it sounded to be very close to their room. So, they knew it wasn't inside their room, so they assumed it must be the flat immediately next door to them, and that maybe that person had opened a window or something, and that's why they could hear them so loudly all of a sudden. Didn't think much more of it. The coughing only lasted a fairly short span of time, and then all was quiet. Next day, when the moment was ripe, she asked her neighbour, "Oh, you okay? I heard you coughing during the night. Is everything all right?" And the neighbour said, "Oh, I don't know what you're talking about. It wasn't me. It wasn't me coughing." So they had no answer for what they'd heard. Just a short time later, though, somebody in the flat 2 floors directly above her flat died. And that made her puzzle. Well, is it something to do with that? Was it some kind of premonition of that death, or was that person coughing prior to die, because they were getting iller as they came close to the end of their life? But that was that. But then a couple of weeks after this person died, they heard the coughing again. And this time it was early in the evening, so they, it didn't wake them up. She was up, and it was very clearly coming from much closer than this flat 2 floors up. The sound was clearly a lot closer, but it didn't sound like it was the other side of a wall. There was no muffling effect, which is why originally when she'd heard it, she wondered if the neighbour had opened her window because there was no muffling noise. But again, she couldn't really pinpoint where the noise was coming from, and never heard it again. So it was just those 2 times. She then moved on to a different block of flats, moved to a different location. And the flat that she used to live in and her neighbour's flat, the one that she had asked, how were you? We were coffee the other night. The two flats were amalgamated into one big ground floor flat. And she heard from the neighbour on the other side, the flat that wasn't amalgamated, sometime later, that the new residents of this new big flat were complaining that they kept hearing her cough loudly when she wasn't coughing. So now we have correlation for the sound has carried on even after the building layout has been changed. The two people or the one person who'd heard it and the person she'd asked about it have changed. The person they thought might have caused it has since died and isn't there, so it wasn't likely to be them. The sound is still going on and seems to still be in that area of where what was two flats is now one flat is actually built. She says, I to this day I can't explain what that was about or why the current residents are hearing it.
You see, when I started reading it, I was thinking, well, clearly this is some kind of paranormal portent. And then somebody passed away and you're like, yes, solved it. And then you carry on reading it and then you're like, well, no.
Yeah, going on.
It's still going on and nobody else seems to have passed away.
No, nobody relevant to it because, herself and the neighbour that she thought it was have both moved out of the property, which has now been amalgamated into one bigger flat, and the person now living there is hearing it. So who knows? Who knows?
How strange. Well, you see, these are the stories I love, where you just scratch your head at the end of it and think, well, what is going on there?
Because on the face of it, they're such simple stories, aren't they?
Yes.
I heard somebody coughing. But when you put together and understand what this... Because obviously this was an exchange of several emails to get this story straight in my mind as to why it was relevant to... When you actually get the nuances of what went on, it's not just the sound of somebody coughing, is it? There's more to it than that. How did it survive the... if you're talking stone tape theory, for instance, if what she was hearing was a replay of perhaps a previous tenant to her, surely the amalgamations of two flats and all that restoration work would have knocked that phenomena out. And yet here we are, the next tenant is hearing it, who is now in the wider space. It does. You can scratch your head over that one for quite some time.
Definitely. Well, I think when we come back from our paranormal trips abroad, Ruth, the next one, as soon as I saw the name, I smiled, Ruth, and you mention it in the text. I thought, I'm sure I've seen something about this on Strange But True. And there, about the fifth paragraph down, you mentioned it was on Strange But True, which I went and re-watched just to check it. I'm quite fortunate. I've got both of the books that came out after that book, and I do like Strange But True. It's one of those that seems to have been lost to the mists of time in regards to why it's not available to buy, or it doesn't seem to be on ITVX or whatever they call their player these days, because it was an ITV programme, I believe. Strange But True.
I think so, yeah.
And it ran for 4 years. They even did a live UFO show. It shows you how popular it was in those heady days of the mid-90s when we all suddenly discovered that there was a lot of weird things going on around the world. And so it seems to sometimes get overlooked because I don't think people sort of view it in the same kind of way as some of the other paranormal programs that perhaps were out at that time, which I find quite odd because it was probably the last one that was on mainstream TV in a primetime slot.
Yes, probably. Yeah. And it was a really good one because it did used to delve into things a bit and actually do, in effect, do what I do and try and find some actual witnesses, didn't it?
Yes.
And try and find some people to actually talk to in programs.
Absolutely. And it covered several from my local area, so I was very pleased with that.
This particular one is from my local area, so
because I know when we were speaking last time, we were on about the ghost plane story that you'd had.
Yes.
And we were talking about that. They did an episode on ghost planes on Strange But True.
Yes, they did. You're right.
Yeah, from just down the road. Strangely enough, where I was the other week, but I didn't see any Lancaster bombers flying around. Sadly, at that particular junction, I was more concerned in getting into a cave to see the Lost Boys on a cinema screen in there. So,
oh, what a place to watch the Lost Boys.
Yes, well, in the delightfully known Devil's Arse cave, Ruth, in Castleton.
Fantastic.
No, I don't either. It's just one of those local things. We all chuckle about it because we're all juveniles with our sense of humour in the local area here in the Peaks.
British are, yeah.
So I was delighted to see Flitwick back amongst it because it, once again, as we were talking about Pluckley earlier, there used to be loads of stuff about this and everybody talking about it being one of the most haunted manor houses. I think Peter Underwood mentions it as well in one of his books. So Flitwick used to be a very well-known haunting.
And shame on you for calling it Flitwick.
Ah.
It's Flitwick.
Ah, you see, that's my Yorkshire pronunciation.
Absolutely, and that's because it's local to me. You see, I know what its actual pronunciation is. So you're absolutely right. It is spelt Flitwick, and the Flit part comes from the River Flit that flows through it, but it's pronounced Flitwick with a sort of silent W, because you know how in the English language we love our silent letters, don't we?
Absolutely. Well, you can always tell when somebody's not from our local area, because there are certain villages and places in South Yorkshire, Ruth, where if people pronounce it in a certain way, you know they're not from the area, because they'll pronounce all the words.
Yes.
Like Dodworth.
That's coming in the book as well, that's from Devon, and the village, if you read the village's name out, it reads very clearly Woolfardisworthy.
Yes.
But everybody local calls it Woolsery. So it's not a silent letter, it's a silent half the word. Yes. we lose the whole Fardisworth bit and just keep the Woolsery. So you really do need to know local sometimes.
Absolutely. Oh, it always keeps us on his toes, doesn't it? It
does, yeah. But yes, so Flitwick Manor, I mean, as its name suggests, it was a manor house that was originally built in 1632, changed hands in 1789 into the hands of the Brooks family. And this is important because this is who they think one of the ghosts is. And it actually remained in that family, you know, through sort of inheritance and so on, for the next 145 years. By 1816, the then incumbent Brooks was a John Thomas Brooks, and he was gifted the house, you know, from other members of his family when he got married to Mary Hatfield. They moved into the house and raised their children there and lived there all their lives, so that, you know, they had the manor house as their main home. And we know quite a lot about, you know, what life was like there and what went on, because John Thomas happened to be a prolific diary writer. So his diaries are still, you know, available for historians and so on, and give us quite a bit about what life at the manor was like. And it's from that we know that his daughter actually died quite young, aged just 26, from illness in 1848, and that he and his wife never really got over the broken heart from losing, you know, their daughter at a relatively young age. But time marched on, as it does, and eventually his granddaughter, you know, long after he and his wife had passed on, it was one of his granddaughters eventually inherited the property, but she never married, which meant she never had any children. So when she died at the age of 81, so she held it for, you know, a number of years. She was 81 when she died in 1934. The direct line of the Brooks family died with her because she had no children. So she left it to a cousin who I think had a different surname, but obviously, you know, was a different branch of the family. But they didn't have that strong tie with the property that had gone on for this sort of, you know, century and a half that the main branch of the family had held the property. So they sort of had it as a second property for a couple of decades, and they put it up for sale in 1953. It had a few different tenants or owners, but eventually, as is so often the case with manor houses, too expensive to upkeep in private hands. So it was sold and it became a restaurant in 1984. And then over the next few years was converted to become a small hotel with restaurant as well. And that's what it's been doing ever since. So since 1990, it's been a small manor house style hotel and restaurant. And it's very popular for weddings. You know, people around here do use it a lot to hold their weddings in and so on. And you're absolutely right. It did feature in Strange But 2 in 1995. Because by then the haunting was really well known, and people would see this figure of a woman wearing black crinoline or a bit of a black crinoline dress. And the popular legend is that this is the ghost of John Thomas's wife, Mary Hadfield, who forever mourned the loss of her own daughter. So it's not the daughter that haunts it, who died there, but the mother who lost her. So that's one of the accountings. If you dig deep enough, you find that other legends say that no, actually the ghost is not Mary Hadfield. It's the ghost of one of the housekeepers from an unspecified period in the house. and it's her ghost that wanders the corridors and so on, and that she's sometimes seen with keys at her belt, which of course housekeepers would have done in the grand houses in the UK, but then quite often so would the lady of the house, depending on how they chose to run their household. So it could be either. And I've seen two different versions of a legend as to why, if it is the housekeeper, why she haunts it. Legend says she was accused or thought to have murdered the baby son of the household by poisoning. And another version of the legend I've seen says that she murdered the actual the owner of the manor house by poisoning. No historical record to back up either of those. So unknown whether there's any truth in either of those or not. But it is one of those things where it always makes me think about how, particularly with UK hauntings, we seem to have quite a penchant for looking at the history of a place and assigning the haunting to the most likely figure in terms of somebody who we knew who it was.
Yes.
And when you think about, the vague figure of a female with a long, dark-coloured dress, possibly with keys at her waist, that could fit most of the centuries that house was in use for. From the very time it was built right up to the time that it became a restaurant. That could have fitted almost any of those centuries. Yeah. Apart from just the very later decades in the sort of 50s and early 60s before it was sold. Yeah. So I always think, well, especially with the fact that there are, more than one locally known legend about who the ghost might be, that it does seem to be a case of ascribe the ghost rather than we know this is actually the ghost. It could just have been any random housekeeper or lady of the house or daughter of the house, but whatever it is, there seems to be this female haunting it. I have even seen an account which suggests there are two separate ghosts. One who is the mother of the lost daughter, and the other is the housekeeper, and that they both wander around the building. So a little bit unclear, depending on which record you are.
Yes, well, at least they're not saying it's Anne Boleyn.
No, I'm grateful for that because, as I have often been heard to say, Anne Boleyn must be racking up some overtime in the ghost world.
She's certainly getting the steps in the amount of places she's supposed to haunt.
She certainly is. But, like anywhere, I've sort of gone out and tried to see if I can find anybody who's actually experienced it haunting there. And, you can certainly find accounts of members of staff seeing glimpses of her stomping along the second floor corridor. That's quite a well-known account, and that she looked very angry, which doesn't fit in with necessarily a grieving ghost, of course. And that particular member of staff at first thought she was a guest and went to sort of say hello, but the figure just disappeared in front of her, which sort of, gave that one away.
Yes.
On another occasion, a receptionist was actually sleeping overnight at the hotel in one of the rooms as part of the shift pattern, and she woke up in the middle of the night because there was the transparent figure of a young girl sitting on her bed. Terrified her so much she ran out into the corridor screaming. The other staff on duty calmed her down and escorted her back in, and they found that all the lights in the room had been switched on, which obviously she hadn't done because she'd run out screaming. There's the sound of footsteps, scent of roses. There was a witness called John Hines, stayed there in 1994, who had thumps on his bed and noises in the room, and he saw the shadow of a woman sitting on his bed, staring out the window. But I, of course, wanted to know if there was anybody firsthand that I could find. And this is a pseudonym, going back to what I said earlier, so this isn't the person's real name, but we'll call her Natasha. So Natasha wrote to me and said that in 2016, she and her partner actually had a flood at their own home, which meant they couldn't stay in it while it was sort of being repaired. So they took a room at the Flitwick Manor, because obviously they lived locally and, that was the most convenient local place to stay in. They had their two kids with them, and on the first night, they settled in, got the room sorted out because they're going to have to stay there for a few days, and they went down to dinner with the children, and when they came back up to the room, every single light in the room had been turned on. And, of course, this is very reminiscent of what's online, for the earlier member of staff that experienced that.
Yeah.
All lights in the room being turned on, and they know they hadn't left the room like that. So that had creeped Natasha out a little bit. Her husband wasn't that bothered about it. So That tends to be the case.
Yes.
Well, certainly with my husband anyway. Yeah, whatever, ghosts, I'm going to bed. So Natasha settles down to go to sleep and gets the kids settled. Husband goes off to sleep. But she found that she couldn't actually get to sleep because she kept feeling freezing cold one minute and then really overheated and hot and bothered the next minute. And she was just getting really fed up. She was still awake at just after 1:30 in the morning because she'd just checked her watch to see what time it was, when she suddenly felt something heavy settle on her legs, just like somebody had sat down on her, putting their full weight down on her. She said she was too scared to even open her eyes to look to see who was there because she was just terrified she'd find a face looking back at her. And because of the way it had pinned her, she couldn't even reach out to sort of try and wake her partner up. It lasted several minutes before eventually just lifting up and sort of fading away as a feeling. And then she was able to kind of roll over and snuggle into her partner and drift off to sleep. Next morning, they wake up, partner's got to go to work, she's got to stay in the hotel to look after the two kids all day, which obviously is going to be a bit of a trial of itself if you're staying away with two young children. She told him about what had happened, but he was, oh, you must probably have been dreaming or whatever. So off he tootles to work, and she busies herself getting the two kids dressed and up and ready for breakfast to go, because obviously they've got to go down to the restaurant for breakfast. Because it felt hot and stuffy in the room where the family had been sleeping all night, obviously, she opened the two windows in the bedroom, which were those old-fashioned sash-type windows. And she said she had quite struggled to push them up. They were very heavy and very sort of stiff. So she had to really sort of yank them up, got them both open, turned away. No sooner as she turned away than both windows suddenly slammed shut together in unison. Yeah, just enough to make you think, okay. It wasn't windy, so it wasn't a case of the wind had rattled them and blown them shut. And she was absolutely sure that they couldn't just have fallen shut because of the way she'd kind of had to force them to open, and they were so wedged. And also, if perhaps one fell and then dislodged the other next to it with the vibration and that fell, but they both went down simultaneously in a real slam sort of thing. So she really did find that not a particularly comfortable experience staying there. And another lass wrote to me to say that when she was 16-year-old in 2017, she worked there as a waitress for a while. And although she never actually saw anything, she always hated doing the early morning breakfast slot, because she said that at that point of the morning when it was all quiet and people weren't yet up and bustling about, it always felt really creepy in the dining room area where she had to work, because part of her job was to set up the dining room prior to the guests starting to filter down for breakfast. So obviously she's doing this pretty early on. And she said she would hear footsteps walking up the corridor outside the dining room. I would go to poke her head out to say, just a couple more minutes, or come on in or whatever. And there would be nobody there. And it used to absolutely creep her out. And she would even go down and check the kitchen, and nobody had walked down the corridor. There was nobody there. She was just hearing the footsteps. And she said she always had the sensation when she heard the footsteps and went back to work that somebody was then there watching over her as she worked. So, strange but true, had it in 1995 and it's still active in 2017.
Yeah.
So.
And of course, this is one of the locations where you can actually go. It is a highly rated hotel. So it's beautiful surroundings, gorgeous countryside.
Absolutely gorgeous, yeah. It's really pretty grounds that it sits in.
Yeah, and I think that the grounds are actually a public park during the day or something, I think. I'm trying to remember.
The main part of the grounds are. So there's like a little garden area immediately around the hotel, which is obviously reserved for the hotel guests. Then the main, what was the sweeping grounds down, are open as a public park that you can go in during the day. But yeah, absolutely, you can book a room there, see whether you experience anything if that takes your fancy. Absolutely. I keep meaning to do it myself with living locally, but you know how busy life gets.
Yeah. But it would be good as well to have a look at some of the reviews on certain sites like TripAdvisor, Ruth, to see if anybody's sort of mentioned had a lovely stay apart from the ghost.
Yeah. I have found those types of reviews with other places I've researched, to be honest.
Yeah.
So it does happen.
Oh, well, I'm glad. It's one of those classic hauntings, and I'm glad it's still making the hairs stand up on people's necks even into the present day. So who knows what else is out there?
Absolutely.
Now, the next one, ironically going on about Flitwick and Flitwick, I know this particular location because I've got a friend who lives in Bournemouth, so I've been through this very beautiful small village, because it's, I think, population's a smidgen over 200. It is one of those little villages that we have in that particular area of the southeast, Ruth, which if you blink you'll miss it, I think, unless you know where you are. And I've heard two people. I've heard somebody call this Kingston Lisle and somebody else call it Kingston Lisle.
I've always known it as Kingston Lisle.
Yes.
I've never heard it referred to as Lisle, but I could see that you could do from its spelling. It's Lisle, which, yes, you could pronounce that as Lisle. But definitely anybody's, I mean, I'm in Bedfordshire, and so Oxfordshire is just one county over, Buckinghamshire sort of thing. And I've only ever heard people refer to it as Kingston Lisle. So that's the one I'm going to go for. But that doesn't mean to say that Kingston Lisle isn't right as well.
Absolutely.
My own village. I live in Mortain, and we have two different spellings for the village. And it drives the post office nuts because both spellings are accurate. So you can either spell the Mortain bit as Moretaine,
yeah,
or you can spell it as Moreteyne. And either way, the post office has to accept it because both are accurate. They did actually run a poll to try and get us to choose one or the other, but the village was equally divided as it should be, so that didn't help.
Well, as well, this location is quite close to one of those wonderful local attractions that we have in certain places up and down the country, because there's a white horse down the road in Uffington, isn't there, near here?
There is, yes. The Uffington White Horse, very famous.
Beautiful.
Really worth a look as well if you're ever in that area. It's definitely worth going to see all the chalk figures, to be honest. They're all amazing, but I've always had a bit of a soft spot for the Uffington White Horse because it has a very freehand drawn look to it that suggests the movement of a horse.
Yes.
It's quite an artistic piece. Yes, and this isn't very far from that. So, no. But this was a story that, again, this was somebody who wrote into me, having sort of read the books, heard me on a podcast, whatever. Again, this is a pseudonym that I'm using. So Caris was born in 1965. And for the first 10 years, she and her extended family lived in or around Kingston Lisle. So that was kind of the family base of operations, if you like. And she describes it exactly as you did. It's a tiny little hamlet, really, very picturesque, very idyllic English rural, with thatch roofed houses scattered through the village, or older style houses. Really, really attractive. She and her parents actually moved away from it when she was 10 in 1975, but she would still return for every summer school holiday, at least until she was 15, because she had a horse that was still kept there on one of the family properties, and that she had that horse right up until 1980, so she was regularly staying in the area to be with the horse. And even now, even in the 2023, she still has family that lives in that village, so she still has ties to it. But she remembers particularly that the house that was next door to the house that she grew up in was occupied by 3 generations of the family, which was the grandmother, the mother, and the daughter of that particular family, which is not Caris's family. And sometimes the mother's cousin, Richard, would come to stay as well when he was a boy. And so he was, at that time, a bit older than Caris, but young enough to be sort of talking to her, if you know what I mean. And he told her that quite often when his family were gathered round their living room, settling down for a quiet night in, they could hear in the bedroom above the lounge the sound of sort of quiet, slowly pacing footsteps, like somebody slowly pacing up and down the room. And they would cross the room above the lounge, go out onto the landing to the head of the staircase, and then be heard slowly coming down the stairs. But they knew there was nobody else in the house. So the 4 of them, the grandmother, the mother, and the daughter, and this is Richard who's telling the story, who was the cousin, were all in the lounge together. So who was this they could hear pacing upstairs and coming down the stairs? And he said it used to happen quite often. Time moved on, house gets sold, and a new owner moves in. This new owner had some friends staying over, one of whom was sort of bunking down in the lounge. And apparently he woke up to see an old lady standing at the foot of where he was sleeping in the middle of the night, and he was so terrified, he got up, packed his bags, and legged it. Which, is a fairly sensible response sometimes. And he actually walked down the road to the Blowing Stone Inn, knocked them up out of bed and said, look, I cannot stay. I've just seen a ghost. Can you please give me a room for the night? And they did, fortunately. There was no way he was going to stay in that property. Now, bearing in mind that Carys moved out in 1975 and then, still regularly staying there till 1980, this must have been in the sort of late 70s, early 80s that this happened. Yeah. So this isn't an old tale. This is a early 80s probably time tale. And this person was scared enough to just pack their bags up and leave and go to the pub. And it's interesting that the Blowing Stone Inn, what a fabulous name, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to think. I'm sure I've seen this covered on something to archaeological program. There's some kind of stone that they've got near there, I think, which is tied to, is it Alfred the Great or something?
It's the legend with it is it's probably, the opinion is divided as to whether it's a natural piece of stone or a carved piece of stone. But whatever it is, it's extremely ancient, sort of monolith type age. Not ever so tall, but it's very oddly shaped and has holes that go right through it. And if you can get your angle right over the holes and blow over them, you can get it to make a noise, apparently. Like blowing over the top of a bottle. Yes. And that's why it's called the Blowing Stone. And the legend is, if you can blow loud enough through it to be heard at the Uffington Horse, then you are the next King of England.
Right, we're off.
So we're off. So it's one of those sort of, sword in the stone type things, but this is the Blowing Stone.
Fabulous.
And you're supposed to be able to tell who the next King of England is through it, which is fascinating. So obviously the whole area is, like we were saying right at the start of this, the UK goes back thousands of years, and that's a prime example, isn't it? That could be prior to historic times as such, if that is indeed Neolithic and sort of contemporary to Stonehenge or Avebury or any of those, and it was indeed a monolith of some sort. If that's the case, then that really is an ancient piece of legend.
Yeah. But it does seem, as we were saying, it's a very small hamlet. But obviously Carys has given you numerous incidents that seem to have been going on. There seems to be a bit of everything in this tiny place. As we would, once again, I return to Pluckley, that it's amazing that such a small little place seems to have had so many distinctly different types of haunting.
Yeah, absolutely. Because there was another one that Carys told me about that said her grandmother used to work at the local school. Now, these tiny little English village schools were really small affairs, weren't they? Going back to the time of Carys's grandmother. If Carys was born in 65, then her grandmother, we're looking at probably the sort of 1930s, maybe into the 1940s, that she would have been working at the village school. And this would have had literally maybe 12 or 15 children in them, tiny little affairs, these little rural schools. So her grandmother was working there, and one day the children had been playing outside for break or whatever, and several of them came running into the classroom, really scared and upset, seeing that they'd just seen floating lights in the little copse of trees that came up to the edge of the village and up to the edge of where the school was. And they were so frightened that they wouldn't go back into that little copse of trees for quite some time afterwards. And they just kept describing what they'd seen as soundless balls of light, which had chased them when they went into the footpath, into the woods. They chased them until they sort of ran along the footpath and ran out. So these were moving balls of light.
Which is odd, really, because a lot of the times when we hear stories of people encountering strange lights that move about in the woods or on the moors or whatever, Ruth, they usually seem to be leading you rather than chasing you.
Do you know, I think I've had them doing every single thing you can think of in my various books. I've had them leading people, I've had them chasing people, I've had them completely ignoring people and bouncing round a field. I've had them dancing round people and passing through them, in various of the books at various times. So whatever that phenomena it is, it's rarer, or certainly with people that contact me, it comes to me more rarely, would perhaps be a better way of, or more accurate way of describing that. People perhaps don't think to write to me about them because they're not strictly a ghost experience, if you think about it that way.
Yeah.
But yeah, I seem to come across a lot less accounts of balls of light, but they do definitely seem to happen. And I've had them described everything from sort of ping pong ball size right up to baseball size. And one particular encounter, again, I can't remember for the life of me which book it's in out of the 6 I've done, but a chap and his friend saw a group of them together ranging in size from sort of golf ball up to football.
Wow.
And there was, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, I think there was 7 or 8 of them. And they sort of came along a hedgerow and swirled round the two men before bouncing off again. So, yeah, make of that what you will. You know, are we talking ball lightning? Are we talking alien? Are we talking fae? Are we talking elemental?
Yeah. That might be worth me having a word with a couple of my fae and folklore research friends, Ruth, to see if that is something that they are aware of, because it may be one of those things that people don't mention it to you, Ruth, because they just think, well, you deal with the paranormal, whereas it depends on the interpretation of the witness, I suspect.
Absolutely, yes. Because if they're thinking, oh, it was something UFO related, they wouldn't necessarily think of writing to me, because I don't present as a UFO researcher or writer. I present as a ghost and hauntings researcher writer.
Yeah.
You know, or they might even think of it in terms of a cryptid, perhaps, or like say fae or fairy, you know, or elemental, which is where we come back circle right back round to by recording this the way I do and all the different phenomena. I mean, here we are with one village, like you say, with a number of different types of phenomena happening around it, and it is a tiny little hamlet. Then what is it about that location that's making is it just coincidence, or is there something particular about the location that means that activity of varying natures, or is it all activity of the same nature but just presenting differently? Who knows? Yeah.
Well, there's a brilliant line in the report that you sent me, Ruth, that says, Caris told me that the area always seemed like a thin place to her, not haunted, but more like somewhere that the past felt only a breath away.
Yeah, and that's actually Caris's words, not mine. That's how she described it to me in her email to me. And I, like you, I thought that was such a brilliant description, that she grew up in this sort of almost timeless, idyllic, rural, not really touched by the modern world in any great, still has its ties to the land. If anywhere was going to be liminal and you know, have either spirits break through or elemental activity still there, or fae or fairy or whatever, that's the kind of place that she's describing. I mean, some of the stories, there are other stories she gave me about, you know, the horses. If you ride round there's certain places just around the village, you know, on the outskirts and the fields, if you go sort of, you know, for a horse ride round, where horses refuse to go or get absolutely scatty. And it's not just the same horse hates the same spot. It's any horse that you ride past will react to it, which in itself is fascinating, because you could always dismiss, you know, oh, every time I ride my horse past this, you know, it reacts. Well, maybe it once scented a fox there or something, and now every time it rides past it has a bad memory because it smelt something scary there once.
Yeah.
But if lots of horses are doing it over a number of years, then clearly there's no easy explanation like, oh, there must have been a fox there or something. There must be something more inherent to that spot than just a transient other bit of wildlife or whatever.
Well, oddly as well, because we've got things that seem to affect animals in such a way, and as we were saying earlier on, animals are usually very good at sensing things, and dogs are excellent assistants when going on a ghost hunt, Ruth. But also that there's two fascinating parts to this particular place. You've got a ghost horse that people have seen, and also a ghost car.
Yes, and this was Caris's own grandfather who saw this. Now, he sadly died in 1971, but he used to often tell her this story of what he'd experienced. And he'd ridden up past Blowing Stone Hill and past the turning for Kingston Warren. And I think when he says ridden, I think we're talking about a bicycle rather than a horse. But he paused at the side of the road at the turning for Kingston Warren, which is another one of the little tiny hamlets there, because he could see a car coming along the road towards him. And obviously very rural little lanes. So he pulled over and kind of waited a moment. But after, you know, he'd waited there sufficient time for this car should have gone past him, and it hadn't. He thought, oh, well, it must have pulled over or something. So he set off again and rode round the bend, only to find that there was no car. It hadn't passed him. There was nowhere from where he'd seen it to where he had stopped, in between those two locations, that it could have turned off and sort of left his view. It could only have pulled into a field gateway, which was shut, not, sort of driven off across the fields or anything, because, well, you don't with cars. Not generally.
No, not usually.
There were no tracks, there were no side roads, there was no houses with drives, there was nowhere it could have gone, and yet it suddenly wasn't there. And he was left to puzzle over that for the rest of his life. But interestingly, the hill that he was on is actually known locally as Scary Hill.
Yes, brilliant.
So again, is it called that because it's one of these liminal spaces, where things are known to happen?
Yeah.
But yeah.
Well, you would suspect as well that this area predates cars, Ruth, because as we say, unfortunately, we don't know if he could recognise the type of car or whatever it was, but I would imagine if he'd seen some kind of Model T Ford trundling down the road, that would have probably been as suspicious as what happened later on, because you'd be thinking, that's a bit weird. So for him to see a car and not think, ooh, that's odd because of the type of car it was, only for it to then disappear, would suggest that this particular part of the area has always been weird. And is it one of those phenomenon where it seems to change into what people expect?
Who knows? Because bear in mind, he died in 1971, so this obviously happened prior to that.
Mm-hmm.
And Carys made no mention of him mentioning the model of the car, which makes me assume there was nothing odd about the model of the car that he felt need to make mention of.
Yep.
Otherwise he would have, that would be part of the story that she remembered, wouldn't it?
Mm.
So therefore, the car he saw must have been sufficiently modern enough at the point at which he saw it, presumably in, let's say, the 1960s perhaps, or late 1950s if he died in 71, for it to have been sufficiently of that era that he didn't take note of it, and then we go sort of even further back to the lights in the wood. We think we're probably in, say, the 1930s or the 1940s. We have another account from Carys of her uncle being on the top of Blowing Stone Hill, which is not far from where this ghost car was seen, and seeing glowing red balls of light go silently overhead, just pass through the sky, at night over them. So all sorts of different phenomena, all in the same area, and all in an area that she describes as feeling so liminal, as if it was somehow thinner there.
Yeah. I think my favourite experience that she shares with you is her uncle, who was telling her about the strange noises he heard, where he basically could hear a loud boing, as though something was bouncing down the road.
Yeah, isn't this really odd? And I'm pretty sure this is the only time I've got this noise described in any of my books.
Yes.
I have got other things bouncing, but not described as making this noise. So again, this was one of her uncles, and he was in bed at night when he heard this weird noise coming from the direction of Fawler Hill, from where they lived in Kingston Lisle. And Fawler Hill is a long stretch of, we call them downs, don't we, in the south? It's sort of grass moorland,
yes,
the southern ones. And that climbs up to that little hamlet of Fawler, so Fawler Hill, obviously. And the best way he described it when he was telling Carys about it was he could hear a loud bouncing noise, like something was bouncing up the hill, going boing every time it made the bounce. It was bouncing quite fast, and it seemed to be louder and louder as it kind of passed where he was and on up the hill. But he couldn't see anything, couldn't make anything out to account for the noise. And he listened to it as it, he heard it coming, heard it bounce sort of past the village on the hill, and then heard it sort of fade away into the distance, as if something big was literally boinging along as it bounced up this hill. And he has absolutely no idea what to assign that to. He's never heard anything that he could even really liken the sound to, other than the best he can say, it sounded bouncy. But he's, and he said it was quite a fast bounce, or faster than anybody would walk or try, a person would bounce something. and yet it travelled past and went up the hill making this weird boinging noise. It's just, I mean, what on earth? And like I say, I've got a lot of accounts of things that bounce that people have seen, but not one that actually made the noise to go with it. So, yeah, who knows? I don't think I want to meet anything that chases me when I'm bounces after me. I think that would scare the living daylights out of me, to be honest.
It is one of those aspects that when you hear a fairly... Because there's nothing frightening about hearing a boing noise. It's a jarring noise. It's not a frightening noise, Ruth, until you probably hear it at 2 a.m. on a dark road in the middle of nowhere with nothing to be making it. That's when a normal noise becomes supernatural. Absolutely,
and becomes scary just by the juxtaposition, if you like, of its normalness in the absence of whatever should be causing it. Because if you hear a boing, you expect to see somebody bouncing something, don't you? Because like you say, boing as a noise in its own right is not necessarily scary, but you put it in the juxtaposition of in the night, travelling past a village up a hill, going at a faster speed than somebody could bounce something. So it's clearly not something bouncing per se, or bouncing very fast if it was bouncing. And yet it's travelling because you're getting the Doppler effect as it went past. Then it becomes quite a scary thing, doesn't it?
Yes. Yes, it does.
Yeah. Good and creepy.
Brilliantly.
And you wonder, people, why I sometimes struggle to sleep at night.
Well, I think the last batch of stories I want to touch on before I let you go, because I can't believe how quickly time has run away from us, Ruth.
Oh, doesn't it just?
Well, it's always great fun in your company, so it's one of those aspects of doing this. We could talk for hours, but I'm sure everybody would probably get bored after 5 hours of us talking about your wonderful work.
They probably would, but you and I would probably still be going strong.
And you've got a collection of stories from a security team based in London, which I've always kept my eye out because I'm aware of the company I work for. Our head office is in London, and I've heard numerous stories of strange things there, primarily because, as with most places in London, it would certainly seem in certain areas of the city, Ruth, they're all built on plague pits, I think, mass graves of some description, and obviously the large number of people who sadly died during the Blitz in the Second World War. There is, sadly to say, there is a lot of buried bodies that have been built upon. One of my most favourite stories from that particular area is the famous paranormal researcher Eddie Burks, who went to Coutts, the Queen's Bank, as it were, to try and remove their local haunting that was causing a lot of their staff to be very put out by it. And so whenever I hear stories from people who work in security or that kind of aspect where they're in these buildings late at night on their own, these stories are always a little bit more chilling, I find.
Definitely. And I was really fascinated to get this particular set of accounts from this particular individual, because funnily enough, I don't often get very many stories from London. Don't know why. My best guess is that because I tend to use social media as a way of going out and asking for people to interact with me. And London, of course, is a huge sprawling city, and so it doesn't use social media in the same way that a small village or small town might.
Yes.
It tends to be just for sale or goods and services, not people just having a chat, because it doesn't have that local area feel to it. So I think it's more about the genre that I use to get out there, rather than the fact that there aren't many London stories. But either way, I was so thrilled when this person wrote to me. But I do have to be very careful not to reveal his true name or the actual locations, because people might recognise who it was who were working in that field, and obviously he has to be careful to protect his role. So I've given him the pseudonym of Caleb, simply because I happen to love the Kings of Leon, and that's the name of their so that's the only reason, because I do struggle to think up the pseudonyms sometimes. But anyway, he was working for a security firm. They covered a number of different sites across London, and this was it within recent years of 2023 where you and I are talking. So we're talking fairly recent times. So the first one came from a bank premises in central London, where this particular building had a very fancy dining room on the top floor where they sometimes entertained their high-profile clients.
Yep.
So there were some offices up on the same floor, but the whole floor had a general sort of air of proper opulence about it. But at some point in the last decade or so, without being too specific, there were some renovations done anyway. And a workman had been brought in to do some of the work, which of course was being done through the day and night, because obviously that tends to happen when you've got office space, because you need it to be back as quickly as possible and functional, don't you? Well, this particular workman was working in this big dining room, and he was up a ladder, and he came rushing to see the security team who were on duty that night. He was really upset because he'd been up his ladder working away when he clearly heard somebody walk up to his ladder and walk round the bottom of it. So he glanced down expecting it to be one of his workmates or one of the security guards wanting something. So he glanced down to speak to them and say, yeah, can I help you, sort of thing, only to find that he was looking at a completely empty space at the bottom of his ladder where he had just heard the footsteps. And it freaked him out enough that he literally downed tools, packed things up, went to see the security guards, who of course checked, and there was, nobody else in the building, and he left and wouldn't come back. Get another workman to do that, because I don't get paid enough overtime to deal with ghosts. Thank you.
Well, especially one of these. This seems like a mischievous one as well, because I know, ironically, you said they're down tools, but it probably took him a while because he'd moved them all about, whatever it was, as well.
He came down the ladder. It had literally, he'd not only heard it, but things had been shifted from where he left it in that few moments before he glanced down. And yes, it literally freaked him out enough to say, I'm out of here.
Yeah. It reminds me of a story I once heard from a plumber who works in the Sheffield area, who was working in a notoriously haunted pub in Sheffield, Ruth, and he was doing something in their cellar, and eventually he just got really fed up because he was doing stuff, and all he kept hearing was somebody tutting while he was working, going as though they weren't happy with what he was doing. And he just got fed up, not because he found it frightening. He just said, I was really annoyed that this person kept criticising my work.
Ghostly censorship, lovely.
But, I mean, the one that he sends you that I just love, this one, is the one that comes from Fleet Street. Which obviously used to be synonymous with the newspaper trade in this country, but doesn't seem to be many based there anymore these days. And I love these kind of stories because it's one of those where somebody sees something that it can't be anybody mucking about. It's got to be something unusual at the very least.
Absolutely. So this was... Caleb had heard this one, sort of from other security guards. And like you say, it was on Fleet Street. And it was at a point where the particular building used to be a bank. And one of the managers was on duty working in the underground vaults of the bank when he saw a man wearing a 1940s era suit, business suit, and a gas mask just simply walk a few feet ahead of him and step out of sight round the end of a set of shelves in the vault. And of course he rushed after the person, but they were gone. The apparition had just disappeared. And so he just had those few moments of sight as the man walked ahead of him and round the end of the shelves wearing his gas mask and gone. And of course you and I know that any underground space in London will absolutely have been used by people wearing gas masks during the World War II.
Yep.
During the Blitz and the bombing, and there were a lot of deaths in the Blitz, so people absolutely would have been killed while wearing their gas masks. It's very hard to say that, by the way. It's a bit tongue twister. Whilst working underground, they would have been killed and what have you. So it's very likely to be either a momentary time slip or an apparition that he'd seen. Yeah.
I love them as well because it dates it so well as well, Ruth. As you just said there were so many people that were wandering around. It seemed like part of, as normal as wearing a hat or a pair of shoes in those days.
Absolutely.
And as you touched on there, a lot of people used to use the tube stations as bomb shelters and things. And I know some of the old bank vaults were used by a lot of people, depending on it. And you've also got the tragedy that occurred at Clapham, I think it was, where
yes.
I think, did somebody trip up, or it was one of those where somebody said something and there was a mass stampede, and I think 150 people were killed in the stampede, including mostly women and children, sadly, as well.
Yeah, who were sheltering and they thought it was about to collapse or something, didn't they?
Yeah.
Somebody said something like you say, and they started a panic. But and it does absolutely date it, because the only point in British history that people will have been wandering around London with gas masks on was the Second World War.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because, a few decades from now, will people be seeing ghosts of people walking around with COVID-19 masks on?
Yeah.
Date it to, the 2020 and 2021, where we walked around with that sort of mask on all the time.
Mm. Well, we've already heard from several parts of the world, especially during the lockdowns and when a lot of people started to work from home, that people were beginning to see more and experience more. And I know some people dismissed it as, well, people are never at home, they don't know what their house sounds like. But I find that very odd, that people aren't saying, oh, well, I've heard funny noises and therefore my house is haunted. People are saying they've seen ghosts, which is not the same as a funny knocking coming from your pipe. Yeah,
or a bit of a creak on your stair or whatever. And yes, okay, people, work from home more because of the pandemic, and even now, there's much more hybrid working than there ever used to be. But people still spent time in their houses before then.
Yes.
They knew what the settling noises of their house were. They went to bed in it every night for however many years. They knew what stairs creaked and what pipe groaned, and hearing something out of the ordinary, they know when they're hearing something out of the ordinary, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course they do. Of course they do, and it just, sometimes it's one of those catch-all explanations that is when you put it under scrutiny, it quickly falls apart, unsurprisingly.
Yes.
Oh, well, Ruth, I think we've whetted everybody's appetite, because obviously the stories we've discussed from the UK on this conversation are all going to be in the upcoming third volume of These Haunted Times, which I cannot wait for. And I know, no doubt, we will speak later in the year, because as you alluded to earlier, you're going to hit us with a double whammy of spooky stories.
Absolutely.
Collected for us all to enjoy, as we have with your previous volumes. So other than getting your word count sorted out and trying to balance those two up, Ruth, what else is on your agenda for the remainder of this year other than visiting haunted locations?
Just that, really. And of course, I'm always up for, if anybody wants to book a in-person talk, I do those as well. I've just done one of those recently. Interestingly enough, for a coven of witches, or a moot of witches, I should say.
Oh.
Which was very interesting.
Fabulous.
But yes, I'm mostly just tied up with the 2 books at the moment to keep me quiet for the next couple of months, and then off on holiday in September. So with a bit of luck, I'll at least get them knocked mostly into shape by the time I go away, because I don't want to be taking my laptop with me. So
yes, keep that baggage weight down, Ruth, if
absolutely.
You're going abroad. Well, once again, thank you for joining me. Thank you for giving me a preview of some of your upcoming work. And thank you for agreeing to help me celebrate 250 episodes. As I've said, this is your 5th appearance on the show, Ruth. Every time I spend in your company is fun. It's enjoyable. Sometimes it's a little scary, but that's more to do with the stories that we cover. So it's always a pleasure. And I cannot wait for these next 2 books, because I've loved everything you've released so far. And all power to you, because as we touched on at the beginning, I think collections like this are vitally important, not only for our paranormal history, but I think also as a social chronicle of the times, and for people who think that only witnesses are having experiences with Victorian ghosts, which is something I still scratch my head about, because the vast majority of stories you cover, there isn't a Victorian ghost to shake a EMF reader at.
Quite often not, no. much more modern I go for. But it's been an absolute pleasure and a real honour to be asked to come on your special show. So always happy to come back because we always enjoy our chat so much. So thank you for that.
Oh, don't worry, I'll hold you to that, and we'll speak later in the year. We might speak twice if I'm lucky enough to pin you down, Ruth. So where can everybody get the books that are out so far and follow your work and keep up to date? And if they've got a story to share with you, how can they do so?
So the books are mostly available on Amazon as paperback, ebook, or if you have a Kindle Unlimited, you can read them for free. But you can get them from other bookstores, and you can also ask your library to order them in. They're available in all those other routes as well. You can find me on Facebook or Twitter. Just Google Ruth Roper-Wylde, spelt Wylde, and you'll find either of those. Or you can email me on ruthroperwylde@gmail.com. No spaces, so just the name all as one word.
Lovely. Well, as usual, I'll put the links for everybody in the show notes and your email address so people can drop you a line. And as I said, thank you again, Ruth. Always a pleasure. And I can't wait to our next conversation, and I can't wait to be reading your next volume by candlelight or even lamp on a dark night. Thank you as always. It's been a pleasure, Ruth.
Thanks, Paul.